Hotel Sukihana's lobby shimmered like a submerged dream. A glowing tank of translucent jellyfish pulsed rhythmically, their gentle movement casting fluid light patterns over polished stone floors and dark wood accents. It was the kind of place where silence felt curated, where even the distant hum of an elevator came softened by intention. Renji Sakamoto, manager of this elegant space, stood near the tank, his reflection split in the curved glass. His eyes, always sharp, always watching, carried a peculiar gleam, as though they had absorbed too much light from moments long past, and never quite let it go. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit, expression unreadable. Renji was a man who moved with economy, every gesture calculated, efficient. His reputation among the staff was almost mythic, faultlessly composed, emotionally untouchable, and yet today, a rare fracture had appeared. It began with a question, gently delivered from his daughter, Yui. "I want to learn piano," she said. She had said it over breakfast, clutching a ceramic cup with both hands, her charm necklace catching the morning sun. A single phoenix feather dangled from the chain, her silent belief whispered once that it would protect her from sadness. It had belonged to her mother. Renji had nodded at the time, too stunned to speak, not because piano was unusual, but because of what it represented. It was her mother's instrument. Renji thought he had hidden the tremor in his hand as he wiped his mouth with a napkin. He even managed to murmur something neutral about needing to find a teacher, but inside, something unmoored. He hadn't touched a piano key in years, not since her mother's last performance. That night had ended in whispered apologies and silence that never fully left. Still, Yui's request wasn't the kind he could refuse. She had so few of them. She never demanded, never made a scene. Just this one thing, music, with no idea what it would cost him emotionally. They searched for a studio in the least invasive way possible. Renji wanted somewhere anonymous. No prestigious academies, no teachers from glossy brochures. He didn't want a name that echoed in his social circles. He wanted silence. They found it almost by accident, tucked between a florist with fogged windows and a bakery that smelled of burnt sugar. The sign read simply, Kurosawa Piano Studio. It looked forgotten, an old-fashioned name etched into a frosted pane. The lettering faded. A small bell jingled as they stepped inside. The first thing Renji noticed was the warmth, not just the heater buzzing quietly near the floor, but the atmosphere. The air was filled with faint notes of lavender, and the distant hum of an old upright piano being tuned. Soft light filtered in through pale curtains, catching on dust motes. And then Haru Kurosawa appeared. She was younger than he expected, dressed in a sweater the color of ash, her hair tied back messily as if she'd forgotten her own reflection. But it was her smile that caught him. Too direct, too knowing. She glanced at Renji, and something subtle shifted. She didn't blink or perform pleasantries. Instead, she offered a gentle nod and focused on Yui. "You're here for lessons?" Haru asked, kneeling to meet the girl's eyes. Yui nodded, and unclasped her necklace to show the charm. "For protection," she said simply. Haru didn't laugh. She reached out gently to examine it, then looked back up. "Then you'll be safe here." Renji felt like he had been disassembled and left standing. There was something in Haru's tone, not pity, but something dangerously close to recognition. She had seen the fracture. He watched the way she guided Yui into the small room behind the curtain, where an old kawaii piano waited, polished but humble. Haru's voice, drifting back from the lesson room, was soft and unhurried. She didn't correct every mistake. She let Yui explore. Renji sat on a creaking bench near the doorway, hands clasped tightly, trying not to react to the sound of music returning to his life like an uninvited ghost. Time blurred. Weeks passed. Yui flourished under Haru's guidance. Her posture straightened. Her touch on the keys grew confident. But more than that, she laughed. She emerged from lessons with cheeks pink and eyes shining. She began to hum around the hotel. She played invisible keys on the table during breakfast. Renji didn't know how to hold it. He started lingering longer after dropping her off, pretending to check emails on his phone. Haru never called him out, but she knew. Her gaze would flicker to him, during rests in the music, her eyes reflecting something he didn't want examined. One afternoon, after Yui's lesson, she wiped her hands on a cloth and turned to him. "You used to play." It wasn't a question. Renji looked up slowly. His throat was dry. "A long time ago." "She has your fingers," Haru said quietly. "She presses like someone who's watched grief be graceful." He didn't answer, he couldn't. And yet something was unraveling inside him. She saw what others didn't. She spoke not to provoke, but to reveal. In her studio, no one pretended. Each lesson deepened the tension. Haru asked nothing personal, but Renji felt laid bare. She noticed the way his hands twitched when Yui played certain chords, minor sevenths, unresolved, the kind his wife loved. She noticed how he never stepped fully into the lesson room, like a man afraid of haunting his own memories. Once as Yui packed her bag, Haru held out a small folded paper to him, a composition Yui had written. "She writes with restraint," Haru said. "That's not from me." Renji took the paper and stared at the delicate lines, the melody hesitant, unresolved. He looked up, suddenly ashamed. "She's afraid of taking up space," Haru continued, not unkindly. "I wonder where she learned that." It wasn't said cruelly, but it was precise, surgical. Renji left in silence that day, his reflection fractured again in the jellyfish tank that night. He stood there long after midnight, alone in the lobby, staring into the slow pulsing glow. He didn't cry, he wouldn't, but his body felt hollow, his breath sharp. Yui's music was growing, and with it his shame. He had controlled everything for so long, the hotel, the staff, the shape of his days, but he hadn't noticed how quiet his home had become. He hadn't noticed how his daughter had learned to live gently, carefully, to avoid disturbing his sorrow. Now, through a hidden studio and a woman with eyes like mirrors, everything was breaking open, and Renji wasn't ready. Renji had spent years mastering the art of avoidance. Emotion, to him, was a risk, a breach in the surface of his carefully constructed life. So when he saw Haru Kurosawa standing alone in the lobby of Hotel Tsukihana, illuminated by the shifting blue light of the jellyfish tank, his first instinct was to turn back toward the elevators, and pretend he hadn't seen her. But Haru had already seen him. She lifted her gaze from the water's glow, and met his eyes, not with surprise, not even curiosity, but with something else, something unsettling, familiarity. Renji stopped. He had no excuse, no errand, no purpose to speak to her. But she was here, unexpectedly, and something inside him, something silent for too long, refused to retreat. "You came," he said, his voice a quiet fracture in the air. "I'm meeting Yui for her recital," Haru replied, adjusting the strap of her small leather bag. On her wrist, Renji noticed for the first time a bracelet, plain, silver engraved with musical notes etched so delicately, they looked like they could vanish with a touch. He didn't ask, but she saw his glance. "From the orphanage," she said, as if she knew the question. "They used to give us these when we left. We all wrote something on them, something we wanted to remember." He said nothing. His silence wasn't unfamiliar to her anymore. "Yui asked me to sit with you during the recital," Haru added, stepping closer. "She said you get tense." Renji exhaled. Tense wasn't the word. He had already felt the panic rising just at the thought of the recital, the risk of seeing Yui's fingers stumble, or worse, hearing his wife's music echo through her, unfiltered. It had become harder and harder to separate the past from the present. And now Haru was here, walking deeper into his life like she belonged, like he'd invited her. "You don't have to," he said stiffly. "I'm perfectly capable of." "I know," Haru interrupted, gently. "But she asked." He looked away. The jellyfish moved behind glass, pulsing gently like the beat of some distant heart. By the time the recital began, the hotel's small performance hall was full. The front rows were lined with parents, guests, and several members of the hotel staff, who had grown fond of Yui. She sat backstage, dressed in a pale dress embroidered with silver threads, her phoenix feather necklace tucked just beneath the collar. Renji sat in the third row, Haru beside him, their arms barely touching. A strange stillness settled over the room, and in that stillness, something unnatural stirred. As the first student played a simple scale etude, soft tones echoed far beyond the piano, as if the hotel itself listened. Faint melodic whispers drifted across the rafters, like wind chimes in water. The audience looked around, unsettled, but Haru simply closed her eyes. She wasn't surprised. She had heard it before. The hotel responded to emotion. Only when something true, something raw, moved through its walls, did the echoes begin. When it was Yui's turn, Renji's hands were rigid on his knees, his jaw clenched. She walked on stage, glanced once at him, not for approval, not for guidance, but for grounding, and sat at the piano. The first notes were light, delicate, a self-composed piece. Renji recognized the opening. It was the unfinished composition she had handed him weeks ago, now expanded into something more daring. Her fingers moved with increasing confidence, touching on minor intervals and crescendos, drawing out something haunted. Then it happened. A passage of music, brief but unmistakable, mirrored a section of his wife's last composition. It slipped into the melody like a secret memory, and when it did, Renji flinched. The room was too quiet. His breath caught, his heart pounded in his ears. That motif had only ever been played once, in a small concert, years ago, and now here it was again, reborn through their daughter's hands. His vision blurred, the room began to twist slightly, as if the edges had lost their clarity. The music swelled, and with it, the sound of the hotel stirring. The magical echo, this time fuller, richer, not just notes, but harmonies, as though invisible instruments had joined in. The guests shifted, uneasy but enthralled. Then Haru did something that shattered him. She reached over and took his hand. It wasn't performative, it wasn't romantic. She didn't look at him, or squeeze. She simply held his hand, grounding him without a word. And that was when it broke. No sob, no collapse, just a slow silent tear, that traced the line of his cheek, and vanished into the fabric of his collar. The humiliation was not in the tears themselves, but in the feeling that he had lost control. Renji Sakamoto, the man who had ruled silence like a fortress, was undone by a child's melody, and a woman's unspoken gesture. He knew others had seen, staff who had never seen him flinch, guests who whispered his name with reverence, but he couldn't stop it. When the music ended, there was a long pause before applause. Yui stood, bowed awkwardly, and looked directly at him. He didn't smile, he couldn't. He only nodded once, slowly, as if thanking her for something he hadn't earned. After the recital, guests drifted into the hallways for refreshments. Renji sat alone on a bench outside the performance room, hands folded. The magical echo was gone now. The hotel was quiet again. Still, the shame still lingered in his chest like a bruise. "You looked like a man being dismantled," Haru said softly, walking up beside him. "I was," he said. She sat beside him, not asking for permission. "It's all right, you know," she said. "To grieve, even after years, especially after years." He glanced at her. "You don't understand." "I do," she replied, brushing a finger over the engraved bracelet on her wrist. "Everyone I ever loved disappeared before I turned 10. Some of us learn to keep silence as a form of loyalty, as if making noise about pain betrays the memory of what we lost." Her words struck deeper than he expected. He looked down at his hands. They were trembling again. "I didn't know how to be a father," he confessed, voice barely audible. "After her mother. I focused on the hotel, on rules, on maintaining structure. I thought if I kept things orderly, I wouldn't collapse." Haru nodded. "But Yui's not a guest in your grief, Renji. She's your daughter, and she's been living in the echo of your silence." He flinched again. The words cut, because they were true. He had thought of her resilience as something natural, not something cultivated in the absence of his warmth. She had learned not to disturb him. She had taught herself to be careful, to be quiet, to stay out of the way of whatever storm was buried inside her father. And yet, she played. She played anyway. She created, despite the weight of unspoken sorrow around her. She reached for beauty. She took the shape of grief, and made it into music. And Haru had become the vessel for all the things Renji didn't know how to offer. Encouragement, vulnerability, presence. "You should hate me," he said. "I don't," she replied, "but I do think you owe her something." Renji closed his eyes. His chest ached. He had spent so many years protecting himself from breaking down, that when the moment finally arrived, he realized the real humiliation was how long he'd let himself rot behind the mask of control. "Will you stay?" he asked. Not as a hotel manager, not as a man, just as someone who needed someone. Haru didn't answer immediately. She simply looked up at the soft glass shimmer of the jellyfish tank nearby, how its silent glow danced in the marble tiles. "If Yui wants me to," she said finally. "Then yes." Renji looked at her, fully this time, and though he didn't smile, something softened in his eyes, a shimmer, perhaps, from tears not yet shed, or the light of the tank refracted through surrender. In the distance, almost too faint to notice, the hotel whispered again, a single soft note, like hope, or maybe forgiveness. Renji began staying during Yui's piano lessons. He didn't announce it, he didn't even sit in the lesson room at first. He just began showing up, 10 minutes early, under the excuse of reviewing emails, or checking hotel logistics. Even though the notifications on his phone remained untouched, he'd position himself near the open door to Haru's modest studio, and quietly observe, never crossing the threshold. But the threshold had long since vanished. Inside, the room had a strange stillness, a sacred hush interrupted only by music and laughter. The children who came for lessons greeted Haru with the same nickname, Sensei Hikari. It had started with a shy 6-year-old boy, who said Haru reminded him of sunlight after rain. The name stuck. Haru never corrected it. She only smiled, and wore the name like a ribbon in her step. Renji found himself captivated, not by the music, but by the way Haru taught. She didn't instruct, she illuminated. Her voice never rose. She didn't scold, she asked questions instead. What did that sound make you feel? Where do you think this note wants to go next? Even when Yui made mistakes, and she often did when nervous, Haru didn't interrupt. She let the silence stretch, made space for the child to find her own way out. One afternoon, Renji stepped farther into the studio than usual. He leaned against the back wall, behind a shelf lined with music theory books and faded student drawings. That's when he noticed the katana. It stood in a sealed wooden case, half hidden behind a gauze curtain, not displayed, not flaunted, preserved. At first, Renji thought it was a decorative piece, but then he noticed the inscription burned into the base. "To hold this is to know restraint." He didn't ask, but Haru, as if sensing his unspoken curiosity, said quietly between lessons, "It was my grandfather's. Before the war ended, he said it wasn't meant for cutting, only for remembering." Renji nodded, but said nothing. Some burdens needed no explanation. Then came the accident. A week before her scheduled performance for the New Year showcase, Yui slipped on an icy step outside the bakery beside the studio. The fall was sharp, sudden. Her forearm bent at a sickening angle. Renji got the call while reviewing schedules in his office, and by the time he arrived at the hospital, his composure had been blown open. He found her curled on the gurney, pale, clutching her phoenix feather necklace, like it might reverse time. The doctors said it was a clean break, but she wouldn't be able to play for at least 6 weeks. "I ruined everything," she whispered. "I broke my song." Renji sat beside her, silent. He didn't know how to comfort her. He had never learned. But then the elevator doors down the hall opened, and Haru stepped out. No grand entrance, no announcement, just Haru, coat dusted with snow, walking directly toward them. In her hands, a small pink box with ribbon ears. Yui blinked. "It's for you," Haru said, placing the box in her lap. "I found it at the flea market last spring, and thought it looked like music you hadn't played yet." Yui opened it, a delicate bunny-shaped music box. When wound, it played a soft, twinkling lullaby in imperfect time, off-tune in places, but sweet. The kind of song that lingered longer than perfect ones. Renji turned away. The gesture was too gentle, too precise. It made the room tilt. Yui began to cry quietly into her good arm. Haru sat beside her, saying nothing, just watching the tiny figurine dance in circles. Renji waited until the hallway was empty before stepping out for air. He didn't expect Haru to follow, but when she did, he didn't resist. They stood near the vending machine, where the harsh buzz of fluorescent light made the moment feel painfully raw. Renji's suit was rumpled, his tie slightly off. He looked like a man hollowed out by his own walls. "I should have been there," he said finally.
I promised myself after my wife, that I'd protect Yui, that I'd be enough, that I'd keep her safe, but I wasn't even there. She was walking from a lesson I forced her into, and she fell, and all I could think was, this is exactly how I failed her mother. He didn't expect a response, he wasn't even sure why he was saying it aloud. Haru didn't move, she didn't nod or rush to comfort him, she simply stood beside him, listening like a still river. I was supposed to drive that night, Renji whispered, the night of the accident. But I was angry. Some stupid argument. She took the car herself, said I needed to cool off. The call came 2 hours later. He rubbed his temples. She was the musician, not me. I was just the man who kept things clean and efficient. That was our deal. She gave Yui soul, I gave her structure. But now she's gone, and I don't even know which part of Yui is breaking when she cries. The words felt filthy, shameful, and yet they had clawed their way out. When Haru finally spoke, it was so quiet he almost missed it. She's not broken, Haru said, she's just waiting for you to hear her. Renji closed his eyes. Something cracked inside. You talk like this is easy, he murmured. Like pain is poetic. No, Haru replied. I talk like someone who has survived. Renji turned toward her. She didn't look away, and then, without asking, without drama, she rested her hand lightly over his on the vending machine's edge. It wasn't romantic, it wasn't dramatic, it was simply, quiet, human, honest. It was the first time in years Renji had let anyone touch him without armor. They drove home in silence, Yui asleep in the back seat, her bandaged arm cradled against her chest. Haru's bunny music box sat between her fingers, still faintly ringing. The sound filled the car with something too soft to name. The streetlights flickered past like ghosted metronomes. Renji didn't speak again. He didn't need to. The silence between him and Haru was no longer hollow. It had become a single, shared note. A sound that didn't demand to be heard, only felt. The grand ballroom of Hotel Tsukihana shimmered beneath 1,000 crystal droplets suspended from the ceiling. Chandeliers shaped like falling rain, catching every glint of candlelight and sequined gowns. It was the night of the annual charity gala, and the space had been transformed into something almost unreal, elegant, curated, unrealistically perfect, and Renji Sakamoto hated every second of it. He stood near the edge of the crowd, dressed in a custom-tailored black suit that felt more like armor than clothing. His face bore the same stoic polish it always did during events like these, silent, unreadable, but beneath it, a storm churned. His sister had ambushed him, a favor, she'd said, tugging at his sleeve, backstage with the same relentless charm she had weaponized since childhood. Just one dance. She's polite, accomplished, and recently divorced. You'll have so much to talk about. Renji knew better. It was a setup. One of his sister's endless attempts to pry him away from his grief and move on, like a broken object duct-taped back into shape. But he hadn't expected the woman to be so cruel. He didn't even catch her name, just her cold smile and sharper tone. Your daughter's cute, she'd said, leaning in too closely. But don't you think it's a bit indulgent to keep clinging to ghosts? I mean, even hotels move on, eventually. Renji had said nothing, just stared, but the words had buried themselves somewhere deeper than he expected. Like glass in soft tissue, he stepped away from the table mid-conversation and drifted toward the edge of the ballroom. The wine glass in his hand trembled slightly. His face remained unreadable, but his vision blurred, not from drink, from memory. He was so close to losing his composure. Then, he heard it, a single note, not part of the string quartet's evening set list, a piano, soft, unexpected, coming from the far side of the room near the garden terrace, where the auxiliary stage sat unoccupied, except it wasn't. Someone had taken the piano seat. Haru Kurosawa. Renji didn't know how long she had been there, or who had asked her to play, but the moment her fingers touched the keys, the room began to shift, not physically, emotionally. The air trembled, the lights seemed to dim just slightly, the murmur of conversation faded into the background, and then came the memory ripples. As she played, the notes shimmered into the air like trails of color, auroras of sound cascading across the ballroom. Not everyone saw it, but Renji did. He saw it all. Each note unraveled into the past, into fragments of his life that had been buried so deeply, he'd forgotten what they felt like. His wife's laughter, echoing in the hotel lobby late one night, when the power had gone out, and they lit candles in jelly jars. The first time Yui fell asleep on his chest, her tiny fingers curled into his shirt, the argument, the slam of the door, the silence that followed, the last time he saw his wife's face in the driver's seat, eyes forward, unaware it would be the last, it all bloomed around him, alive and unbearable. Renji stepped backward into a pillar. Guests moved past him, oblivious to his internal collapse. The music continued, spiraling upward into a crescendo that wasn't flashy. It was intimate, exposed. This wasn't a performance for the gala. It was a song meant for him. He watched Haru's expression. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't pretending. Her eyes were open, focused, not on the audience, but on the keys, on the message she was sending. You are not invisible. You are not alone. The final notes faded into silence like petals falling onto water. Polite applause followed, but it was disconnected, half-hearted. The guests didn't understand what they had heard. But Renji did. He left the ballroom without a word. Haru followed. They said nothing. As they walked down the long marble corridor, past the jellyfish tank, the creatures inside pulsed with soft blue light, undisturbed by human emotion. Renji's shoulders were hunched, uncharacteristically so, as if the music had peeled away the last of his composure. Outside, the snow had started to fall, thin, hesitant, melting as it touched the hotel's warm pavement. They walked to the staff exit, and stepped into the silence of the garden terrace, now empty under the moonlight. Renji sat down on the low bench near the plum tree. I hated that, he said, voice low. The ballroom, the people, the idea that healing means replacing. Haru didn't sit. She stood beside him, arms crossed against the cold coat, fluttering in the breeze. It doesn't, she said. Healing means listening, even to the parts of yourself you were told to ignore. Renji looked at his hands. Everyone keeps telling me to let go, but no one tells me what to do with the pieces once I have. Haru finally sat, not beside him, across from him, so he had to meet her eyes. You don't let go, she said. You learn to carry them differently. Renji's throat burned. I don't know how to feel anymore. I'm either frozen or drowning. You felt something tonight. I felt humiliated, he snapped, sharper than he meant to. I was standing there shaking like a child, while he stopped, shame twisted in his stomach. You made me remember things I locked away for a reason. Haru didn't flinch. Good, she said. They deserve to be remembered. He stood pacing. You don't understand. This hotel, this image, this control I've held. It's the only thing that kept me from breaking. You're already broken, Renji, she said. But broken isn't the same as ruined. He stopped walking, and for a long moment, the only sound was the wind brushing against the frost-covered branches of the plum tree. Then his shoulders dropped. I don't want to be alone, he said quietly, but I don't know how not to be. You don't have to do it all at once, Haru replied, finally rising to her feet, and walking toward him. You start with tonight. He looked up, finally meeting her eyes, and something, whatever strength he had left, gave out. He crumpled, not into collapse, but into her. She caught him, not dramatically, not like some romantic cliché, but firmly, gently. She wrapped her arms around him, and held him as his breath hitched, and his hands gripped the back of her coat, like a man lost in his own storm. No words, no music, just breath and presence, and raw human grief. She didn't let go. When they returned to the hotel, neither spoke. Haru took his hand, and led him, not like a lover, but like a guide, through the hallways, past the ballroom, past the tank, where jellyfish drifted like silent prayers, to a room, any room, one with soft lighting and curtains that didn't quite meet in the middle. Renji didn't want a bed. He sat on the floor, so Haru sat beside him, and that was how the night passed, not in passion, but in quiet vulnerability. She held him when he cried. She sat beside him, when he couldn't speak, and when he finally drifted into sleep, slouched against the wall, like a man emptied of grief. Her hand remained on his, a single shared note, still playing.
The days that followed the gala unraveled slowly, like a thread pulled quietly from a worn sleeve. Renji went back to work. He took meetings. He reviewed hotel reports. He stood beside the jellyfish tank with its constant blue glow, unmoved, unchanging, and little by little he began to retreat. It started with missed messages. Haru had sent one or two simple texts, not declarations, not demands, just quiet words. Yui left her notebook here. Let me know when she can stop by. The weather's warming a little, maybe Yui would like to try composing outside. Renji saw the messages. He read them, but he didn't reply. Then he canceled Yui's next piano lesson. She needs rest, he said simply. She's been overwhelmed. But it was Renji who couldn't breathe. Ever since that night, the bench, the breakdown, the unbearable honesty, he had felt something dangerous growing in his chest. Not grief, this time. Not pain. Something worse. Hope. It terrified him. He began avoiding the studio altogether. Made sure someone else picked up Yui when she asked to visit the florist or the bakery next to Haru's studio. He pushed her toward new hobbies. Drawing, reading, even fencing. Anything that wasn't music. Yui went along with it at first, quietly. She didn't ask questions, but he saw it, the way her sketches started to lose detail. The way her energy dimmed, like the color fading out of an anime scene when a character is holding in pain. Even the little phoenix feather around her neck seemed duller. One morning, Renji found her newest drawing on the kitchen counter. A chibi knight, oversized head, tiny armored body. The character wore Haru's ash-colored sweater, her messy ponytail, and wielded a glowing sword in the shape of a music staff. A little speech bubble floated beside her head. I will protect the sound in your heart. Renji stared at it, heart folding into itself. He should have said something. Instead, he quietly put it in the drawer. Then Yui vanished. It was just after school. Renji arrived home to find her backpack, dropped near the entryway, her phone on the kitchen table, untouched. Panic hit him instantly. He tore through the apartment, called the school, called her friends, checked the hotel, nothing. Then a sinking instinct pulled him toward the one place he hadn't let himself think about. Haru's studio. The street was darker than usual when he got there. The sky was gray, low-hanging. The light in the windows was dim, soft yellow glowing through the paper blinds like a half-closed eye. He pushed the door open hard enough to rattle the bell. Yui looked up from the piano bench, where she sat cross-legged, arms crossed, eyes red. You lied, she said flatly. Renji froze. The studio was so still it felt staged. Haru stood near the bookshelf, silent, not intervening. You told me we were okay, Yui continued, her voice cracking. You told me music was good for me, that I should play, and write, and let it out. He opened his mouth, but the words weren't there. I saw you that night, she said, after the recital, after she played. I saw you cry, dead. I saw you feel, you were finally real. And now you're going back to being a ghost. Her voice trembled. I don't want a ghost for a father. The words hit harder than anything she'd ever said. Still, he tried to recover. You don't understand, Yui. It's complicated. No, she snapped. It's not. You're scared. You're scared to need people. And you keep shutting us out because you think hurting alone is safer. I've done what I could to protect you. No, you've done what you could to protect yourself. And then she stood, grabbed her coat, walked past him, eyes burning. She stopped at the door, not turning back. I'm going to stay with Grandpa for a while. Renji couldn't speak, couldn't move. He heard the bell jingle behind her. Then silence. Only Haru remained. She didn't cry. She didn't yell. She just looked at him with a tired kind of sadness. A quiet ache. I knew, she said. The moment you started pulling away. I've seen it before. That fear. He turned away from her gaze. He couldn't bear the way she looked at him. Not with anger, but with disappointment. I thought I could be patient. I thought I could give you space and time to figure out how to breathe again. He said nothing. But the truth is, I can't be the only one breathing. Her words were soft, but final. Yes, I love you, she said. But I can't make you love yourself enough to love me back. He didn't look up until the bell rang again. And Haru was gone. Renji stood in the studio alone, surrounded by the fading traces of lives that had opened to him and been shut out. He returned home that night, like a man returning to a crime scene. The apartment felt colder than usual, empty. Even the digital clock on the stove blinked at him like an accusation. He sat at the kitchen table with the lights off. That's when he found the letter, folded into the back of a drawer in Yui's room, still sealed, yellowing at the edges, written in his wife's hand. If you're reading this, Renji, it means I'm gone. I hope you're still the man who watches the sunrise when he can't sleep. I hope you still hum when you clean. I hope you still believe that someday, love will find its way back to you. Please don't close the doors. Not to Yui, not to the world, not to yourself. I was never afraid of dying, I was afraid of you shutting down after I was gone. Let them in, Renji. Let yourself in. He couldn't breathe. He folded over the table, letter in hand, and broke. This time no one caught him. There was no Haru, no Yui, just the quiet of a man finally letting go of the barricades he'd mistaken for shelter. And as he cried, the first time, really cried, something shifted. The colors around him began to return, slowly, like sunlight bleeding back into a water-washed painting. The room no longer looked like a museum of grief. It looked like home. Incomplete, yes, but alive. He wasn't okay, not yet, but he was finally feeling, and it was enough to begin. The morning of the recital was gray, but soft, a veil of calm draped across the city like a held breath. Renji stood outside the venue for a long time, before entering, his hands clenched in the pockets of his long coat, heart rhythm, mismatched, and uncertain. He hadn't been invited directly. Yui hadn't said a word about it after leaving for her grandfather's. No schedule, no time, nothing. But he knew. He found the date scrawled in the corner of one of her drawings left behind in her room. Just a number. A place. She hadn't written, "Dad, come." But something deeper than pride, or maybe just desperation, pulled him there anyway. The recital hall was modest, tucked in a community center near the riverside, the kind of place where the walls echoed faintly, even when no one spoke. Rows of low-backed chairs filled the space, and the large window near the stage was slightly open, letting in the late afternoon breeze. Through it, sakura petals drifted in from the trees outside, dancing mid-air before settling silently along the windowsill and piano keys. The soft pink fluttered like an old memory, too beautiful to ignore. Yui hadn't started yet. She was in the back, with the other students, her bandaged wrist now fully healed, but still carrying the ghost of its fall. When she stepped out, the light caught her necklace, the phoenix feather, and for the first time in weeks her eyes were bright. She saw him. Renji didn't smile, but he inclined his head slightly, his hands now unclenched, folded in his lap. She saw it for what it was, a beginning. She sat at the piano, with a confidence he'd never seen before. Not pride, not arrogance, but belonging. Her fingers touched the keys, and for a second, the hall quieted into reverent stillness. The music began. It was familiar. The piece she'd performed once before, the one that had opened the echoing wounds of his past. But something was different. The notes had been rewritten, subtly, masterfully, as though someone had gone into the shadows of the composition and placed lanterns, lit paths where once there were only uncertain turns. Then he realized, Haru. Yui had said nothing, but the influence was unmistakable. Certain phrases nodded toward Renji's wife's final melody. Others whispered themes from his daughter's own early sketches. And some were entirely new. A conversation between past and present, sorrow and strength. It was a song not of grief, but of survival. When the final chord faded, the audience applauded politely. But Renji stood. He didn't plan to speak, hadn't written anything down. But something inside him, whatever had broken that night in the kitchen with the letter in his hands, urged him forward. He walked to the microphone near the front of the hall. The wind shifted, another petal floated in. Yui watched him. Her expression unreadable, but her hand clutched the phoenix feather. Renji cleared his throat once. His voice didn't tremble, but only because he spoke from somewhere deep, past the fear of shaking. I don't usually speak at events like this. I'm a hotel manager. I deal in silence, in polish, in making sure everything looks like it's supposed to. He paused, but sometimes what's supposed to doesn't mean anything. The audience stirred slightly, unsure. My daughter, Yui, she lost her mother young, and I thought if I kept things controlled, if I stayed strong, I could make life easier for her. His voice dropped, but in the end I didn't protect her. I shut her out. People shifted in their seats, now listening closer. I didn't understand the kind of strength it takes to open your heart after loss. Not until someone showed me. His eyes found Haru, standing in the far corner, hands clasped gently. That music you just heard, it wasn't just a performance. It was a message, a bridge. He looked back at the audience, and I want to thank the person who helped build that bridge, who saw things in my daughter, and in me, that I was too afraid to face. Silence followed. Then he stepped down. No more applause, just stillness.
but it was enough. That evening, the apartment was changed. The cluttered digital keyboard, that had once sat in the corner of the living room, was gone. In its place stood a real piano. Polished, upright, humble. It hadn't come with a ribbon or announcement, just an open lid, and a sheet of blank staff paper, resting on the stand. When Haru arrived, hesitant, uncertain, she found the door already unlocked. Renji didn't greet her with fanfare. He simply gestured toward the bench. "Sit?" he asked, voice quiet. She did. He sat beside her, and together they improvised. Nothing written, no plan. She started with a soft arpeggio. He joined hesitantly, a few bass notes beneath. Then silence. Then more. Like a conversation where each moment of vulnerability opened another. They weren't flawless. The notes missed. The tempo wavered. But it didn't matter. It was trust. It was harmony. It was love. Not perfect, or loud, or polished. Just real. The rooftop scene came 3 nights later. Yui's doing, entirely. She had begged Renji for help setting it up, dragging fairy lights up the stairwell, with the stubborn joy only a child could maintain. They wrapped every pole, every planter, every railing, until the rooftop glowed like a starfield. Then she set out paper lanterns, some electric, some powered by tiny flickers of magic. Haru didn't question. Floating lights hovered in the air, like fireflies caught in a dream. Yui pulled her father aside. "You're not going to mess this up, right?" she whispered. Renji raised an eyebrow. "I'll try." She handed him a small envelope, inside a folded chibi drawing of her, pointing a sword of musical notes at a scribbled version of Haru's silhouette. "Confess, or face the music," he chuckled. For the first time in what felt like years, it wasn't hollow. When Haru stepped onto the rooftop, she stopped short. It was overwhelming. It wasn't a performance space. It wasn't a stage. It was a gift. Everything shimmered like a storybook. Then Renji walked to her. He didn't give a speech this time. He just took her hand. "Don't stay for Yui," he said softly. "Stay for me." The silence between them was full, not with tension, but with choice. Haru reached into his coat pocket, placed something there. A key. "I already made myself at home," he said. And under the fairy lights, surrounded by floating magic, and one triumphant child, hiding behind a potted plant with sparkles taped to her cheeks, they stood close. There was no need for music this time, because the song had stayed, and it would keep playing, not for the past, but for the future.